Hello and good evening. Welcome to the Edinburgh International Book Festival. This is part of a series in partnership with the New York Times, and this is our panel on women in politics. We are so happy you are joining us. You can support the Edinburgh International Book Festival through the Festival Bookshop, which can be found at https://shop.edbookfest.co.uk. Is it just me, or does anyone else feel like we are living in truly extraordinary times? I think we all have a tendency to imagine that our times are the most interesting, but really, the US is headed into an extraordinary presidential election on the heels of an extraordinary presidential election. 2 years after that first extraordinary presidential election, we saw record numbers of women elected to political office in the US, including women of color and LGBTQ women. And last week, we had another historic first. Kamala Harris became the first woman of color to join the presidential ticket of a major US political party. Naturally, we are having this conversation on a day of major historical significance. It's the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage in the US. And all of this is happening against the backdrop of a global pandemic. A century after another global pandemic almost derailed the suffrage we're now celebrating. That was the so-called Spanish flu. There have been gains, but they are fragile. The pandemic has certainly affected the security and safety and health of women across the world. And we are seeing rollbacks everywhere as women's rights are threatened. And yet we hear at the same time so many women's voices raised louder than ever. Protest, protest, protest. We're going to get to all of this today. On this panel, I am delighted to introduce first Elif Shafak. Dr. Shafak is an award-winning British-Turkish novelist and the author of 17 books, 11 of which are novels. Her most recent book, 10 Minutes, 38 Seconds in This Strange World, is currently on my nightstand. Also on my nightstand is The Education of an Idealist, a memoir by Samantha Power. Ambassador Power served as the 28th US permanent representative to the United Nations, as well as a member of President Obama's cabinet. She is also a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, and now she is teaching at Harvard. Finally, I am thrilled to introduce my colleague, Jennifer Harlan, who is stepping in for Veronica Chambers, who couldn't be with us today. Ms. Harlan is a journalist at the New York Times whose work focuses on storytelling across platforms. She is the co-author of Finish the Fight, which tells, at last, the unknown stories of women from diverse backgrounds who fought for suffrage. You may be wondering if her book is on my nightstand too. And the answer is not yet. The book only came out today. Welcome, welcome. I am so happy to have you here with us. Thank you for being here. I'm going to start by talking about women in leadership roles. And I'd actually like to preface this by also pointing out, and we've discussed this before and everyone agreed it was okay, but for the sake of ease and smoothness, I am going to refer to my wonderful panelists by their first names. I hope they will forgive me and you in the audience will forgive me. Otherwise it becomes quite a mouthful. But I want to start by talking about leadership and Samantha, if I may, the first question is going to go to you. I also want to point out to all the panelists that if you have something to say, jut in there, say it, raise your hand, get your voice heard. Women are too often not heard. This is your time. So, Samantha, many have argued that women make better leaders. And in the midst of COVID, we've seen that argument come up again and again and again. And I'm looking at you, Jacinda Ardern and Angela Merkel. Samantha, you have been the sole woman in rooms full of male leaders. Do you agree? Do you think that women make better leaders? Do you think that female leaders today have done a better job with COVID? And I'm curious also if you think it's something innately female.
Well, first, maybe we will start where we would wish our leaders to start and where at least most of the female leaders that we have responding to COVID today are starting, and that's with the data. So, we don't have perfect studies by any means, but there was a May study that said that female-led societies at that time were experiencing 6 times fewer COVID deaths. Nick Kristof ran the numbers, the New York Times columnist, in June, and he surveyed 21 countries, 13 of which were led by men, 8 by women. And the countries led by men, according to Kristof, experienced 214 deaths per million, so done, proportional to population, while the female-led countries were 36 deaths per million. So that's the data such as it is. There have been other studies that, are questioning whether this is correlative or consequential, and those are, I think, fair questions. But what we know is that the leaders who are faring better are those that bring qualities that have correlated in lots of industries and institutions with female leadership. So empathy, coalition building, a greater propensity maybe to listen. I think Jacinda Ardern and the press conferences she has done specifically for kids, you can't really think of a male leader doing something like that. I'm not sure that's certainly not been the difference maker in New Zealand in terms of the data. Some of the decisions she's made in terms of travel restrictions and closures early probably had a lot more to do with that, but that ability to connect with people. And then, of course, where I started, the tendency to put expertise, let's say, over ego. I guess the two things I'd say in some tension with drawing too big a conclusion from this is, in terms of at least innate gender superiority, is number one, sadly, devastatingly for American families, but the US numbers are skewing the statistics. I mean, you have with just Modi, Bolsonaro, and Trump, the vast majority of cases. You're going to see that's going to weight the calculus, since those are a particular form of male leader, populist leaders who are, at least in the case of Bolsonaro and Trump, very hostile to science and expertise, hostile to global cooperation. But the other thing I'd say, which you could view as about correlation or about consequence, is think of what it took for those women to obtain power. Even in advanced Western European democracies like Germany, Finland, Iceland, and in countries like New Zealand and Taiwan. I mean, what these women have been through the ringer, we all know from our own lives, what the hurdles that they've had to clear, hopefully fewer than previous generations. But, the fact that there are more hurdles in the way in so many countries tends to mean that those who've cleared those hurdles have some adaptive leadership qualities along the lines of what I've described. So I think it says something. It doesn't say everything. If the US had been under proper leadership that looked at science, that believed in the expertise that lies within the bureaucracy, that was willing to listen and learn to other countries, we'd probably see some leveler in that.
So I'm going to do something I hadn't actually planned, but it'll be like a little bit of a game show. We're going to be talking about imagination today. And I want my three esteemed panelists here to just use their imagination and raise your hand. There's no judgments here, but raise your hand if you were building a country, an imaginary country from scratch. In the COVID era, would you put a female leader in charge?
Sure.
Of course.
Okay. Just curious. Anything, you certainly don't have anything to add. I wasn't planning on asking that, but as I thought about it, and as I think we sort of dream or imagine a world that might be, it was something that kind of came to mind. Elif, if you have anything to add to that, please do.
No, definitely I would put a woman in charge, but also I would like to see more women in politics, particularly in decision-making processes, in executive leadership. And when I say women, I mean women of all backgrounds, all walks of life, but also I think it's very important that we give a bigger voice to minorities. So I would love to see this, this ratio changing. And we know that it takes a long time. I think there was a lot of optimism, particularly in the late 1990s, early 2000s, this assumption that communism, the Berlin Wall had come down, that fascism was no more, that liberal democracy was the only triumphant ideology, that from now on history could only move in one direction, in a linear, progressive way. That assumption, of course, has failed. But back then, many people used to think that women's rights, LGBTQ rights, freedom of speech, these were concerns that were shared by citizens of some other countries, some liquid lands, but the Western world in general was regarded as more solid, more safe, more established democracies. You didn't have to worry about women's rights. That was the assumption, and I think that assumption has been shattered, especially after 2016, with Trump, with Brexit, then came COVID, which revealed the existing inequalities. And more we do know that actually history can go backwards. There's no guarantee that tomorrow is going to be more developed, more advanced than yesterday. And if it is true that countries can go backwards and tumble into ultranationalism, religious fundamentalism, populist nationalism, and eventually authoritarianism, I think we women need to be much more concerned, and we need to be more alarmed, because wherever we've seen an increase in these forces, we've also seen an increase in sexism, an increase in homophobia, and a consolidation of patriarchy. So the question for me is very relevant, because coming from a country like Turkey, which is a very patriarchal country, but that doesn't mean that women are weak. That doesn't mean that women are timid. When you talk to women, women are actually very vocal in many areas, but there's one area in which women are almost non-existent, and that is politics. So when it comes to regional, national, and also local politics, especially as you move the ladder up, you don't see women. And all the people who make the decisions are conservative, ultra-conservative men with a certain worldview, and that changes everything. So yes, in the post-COVID world, I wouldn't want to go back to how the world was before the pandemic. Sometimes people, with all the good intentions, they ask, are we going to go back to normal? But that wasn't normal anyhow. And I hope this will be a new beginning in which we can see more women in decision-making processes and in executive leadership.
Fantastic. I think we're going to be getting on a lot of those points, actually. So I'm glad you gave us a preview on that. And I want us to just stick with you for a moment, if you don't mind. I know that you've talked a little bit about emotion in politics. So I'm thinking anxiety, anger, distrust, fear, but also hope, excitement, enthusiasm, sentiment and feelings are absolutely underlying how people end up casting their votes. And I think politicians know this. These kinds of emotions are deeply woven into political narratives, speeches, ads, commentary. But Elif, you have pointed out in the past that mainstream political theory pays very little attention to feelings. And I'm curious, why do you think this is so? And how can we better acknowledge that really critical role that emotions play in politics?
I think we need to start by accepting that we're all emotional creatures, men and women, East and West. Again, where I come from, people tend to think that women are emotional creatures. We are all emotional beings. And interestingly, what we remember through emotions and through stories. Our memory also works in that way. And I do believe we're living in an age in which particularly negative emotions have become so heavy, understandably, because there's so much uncertainty. It almost feels like the ground beneath our feet is not solid anymore. So there are lots of negative emotions each and every one of us needs to deal with, starting with anxiety, almost like an existential angst. And of course, there's anger, which can be a positive force, but it can also be destructive. Then there's fear and resentment and maybe bitterness. And all of that is very understandable. Actually, I think it's okay not to be okay. It's okay to be anxious. And maybe if we're not angry, if we're not worried, maybe we're not really following what's happening here and there and everywhere. But the question is, what do we do with all these negative emotions? Is it possible to channel them into something more constructive, more positive, and more progressive? And the thing that I lament is, unfortunately, populist demagogues, I think, are much better or advanced in terms of recognizing the power of emotions. When they speak, they do speak directly to emotions. And maybe we need to understand the power of emotional intelligence better. And in a way, the power of stories and storytelling and empathy better as well. That should always be on the table. When I say that, I'm not underestimating the importance of data. I'm not underestimating the importance of research, absolutely. But it's very interesting that unless we juxtapose all of that with emotions and with storytelling, our narrative is not as strong enough.
Do you think it's easier to speak to sort of hook people on negative thoughts and emotions than it is on hope or enthusiasm?
Yes, because negative emotions, they are long lasting. But it also depends on the negative emotion we're referring to, such as anger. I mean, we're living in an age in which so many young people, so many of us have taken to the streets for dignity, for equality, for justice. And in a way, that kind of anger is an important starting point because it's also the antidote of numbness. The one thing that scares me the most is numbness, is indifference. The moment we become desensitized. If I stop caring about what's happening in the States, if you stop caring about what's happening in Turkey, imagine if we stop caring about what each and every one of us is going through, then those walls of numbness, I think, will be the most destructive things around us. So again, I don't want to just label emotions as negative and positive. It all depends on what we do with all those emotions.
Absolutely. I'm gonna take that idea, and I want to just talk about some of the protests that have been happening. You know, to those who've been watching, which is everyone, I think, 2020 may feel like the year of the protests. The stakes feel higher than ever. And women have always played a really large part of that story, even if their personal stories aren't always noticed. And in fact, some of the research actually suggests that when women participate in protests, the movement is more likely to remain peaceful and more likely to succeed. So, Samantha, if I may start with you, there are so many places to look. We've got Belarus, we have Lebanon, we have the US. I mean, the list really goes on. And I'd love your thoughts on whether protests are essential and what kind of outcomes we can see, what we can expect to see in terms of change and movement and growth.
Well, I mean, I think it's hard to generalize. You know, there are certain circumstances, I suppose, where a political alchemy kind of comes together, and you could argue that protests, you know, that the protests aren't the sine qua non of whether political change can happen. But that's got to be a pretty rare circumstance. I mean, I think protests are a form of accountability in many of the societies where we've seen protests over the last 2 or 3 years. There are societies where people had lost faith in democratic action, in voting in elections, or in a country like Sudan, they'd never experienced elections. And indeed, I think Sudan is the most awe-inspiring example of what you're describing, where estimates are that 2/3 of the women active in the people active in the protests were women. The immortal image of one of the female protesters up on a tank, I think, you know, talking to her counterparts. Yeah, it's just beautiful image, but also then what transpired, of course, was a political transition, women included, but not included nearly as much as would have been just, I suppose, at least in light of the numbers in the protests. In Belarus, I think it's really fascinating what's happening. Not only did you have 3 sort of female candidates active in a presidential election against kind of the embodiment of a male, whatever, goon dictator who had been in power for 26 years. I say the embodiment of a male goon because he actually taunted these women and said that women should be at home cooking dinner, that they had no business in politics. And then it looks like, because the women involved sort of revealed one of those qualities of leadership that we talked about earlier in the COVID context, coalition building, they decided to pool their resources and their political support and effectively ganged up. And, you know, we won't know, of course, ever what actually happened in the election because so much of it was rigged, but may well have, in fact, defeated this dictator of 26 years, and certainly have unleashed a protest movement now that does not look likely to go back in the box. A protest movement that was initially, in the early days, led by mothers and wives and daughters of people who'd been detained, with the women in white, you know, modeled off the Cuban protests, you know, over so many years, and those in Chile and Argentina as well, where it was the madres who came out to the public square first on behalf of their loved ones. But now you have those women joined by car factory workers and steel workers and state media now, covering the protests in defiance of Lukashenko's wishes. So I think when you ask, though, are the protests sufficient? Belarus in a way is a great example. It is certainly sufficient now to have pushed Lukashenko to the edge. It is sufficient to have shown people who had suppressed, actually, Elif's colleague, Timur Kuran from Turkey, has done unbelievably important work about preference falsification. And one of the reasons we experience so much revolutionary surprise in a place like Belarus or in the Arab Spring, or in the Me Too movement for that matter, is that people are suppressing their voices, suppressing their thoughts. And then there becomes a moment where they see a sufficient number of people expressing and they feel a safety of sorts, at least, or a motivation that they hadn't felt before. And I think Timur's insights are very much at play in Belarus. But is the future of Belarus merely in the hands of the protesters? We don't know what Putin is prepared to do. We don't know what these larger forces are prepared to do. But it is absolutely the case that protests help people lose their fear. It helped show the extent to which views that people might have thought were narrowly held are much more broadly held. And I think a lesson that we take here, and I apologize for just making one additional point, but when Barack Obama was elected in this sort of, for me at least, was this kind of insurgent campaign that I was privileged to be a part of, and was the shattering of a glass ceiling for African Americans, and the representation, the embodiment of so much decency and a lot of progressive instincts and policy ideas. I think there was, in retrospect, a tendency of the very people who had comprised this movement to put Obama in office, because it could never have happened. I mean, he couldn't have gotten the Democratic nomination, never mind the presidency, without this people-powered movement and this very broad-based coalition, very diverse coalition. But there was a sense of, with some at least, he's got this. And what I think we've learned over those 8 years, and as Elif was saying, with the election of 2016, is we can never do that again. It's almost like we have to adopt a mindset, particularly in an era of polarization, of permanent campaign, permanent accountability, permanent activation, and not the kind of baton model of we protest and then we hand it off to our friends who become elected officials. In some countries, that just is never the case, where the protesters there's never a space for them in higher office, like women in Turkey, as Elif was saying. But in other places, it just is the case that accountability has to be maintained. And I think that's what you're going to, if Vice President Biden ends up winning the American election, I don't think you're going to see the abating of activism in the way that we saw over some of the Obama years. Right.
I'd like to actually take it back a moment. And Jennifer, you are up. You have just completed or are about to complete a huge project at the New York Times on suffrage. And you wrote a great deal about the tactics and strategies of the suffrage movement. And in many ways, you told me, they laid the groundwork for what we're seeing in the streets today with the same tactics and tools still in use. I'd love for you to talk us through the parallels between the activism then and what we're seeing now, and basically kind of bring us up through history.
Sure. So I think what's interesting is when you look at what's happening in the streets today, there is a tendency to think of it as this very contemporary and fresh thing, when in fact, a lot of the very same tools and tactics that we do see today, as you mentioned, were honed hundreds of years ago. This is not new for people and for women to be out in the street. We're in this moment, as you mentioned today, this marks 100 years since the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which established American women's right to vote. Although, of course, that the promise of that amendment, that all this victory had been achieved and all of these women could now vote, was incomplete. And for many women, particularly women of color, it would take much longer and much more activism and work that is still happening today to ensure that that was fulfilled. But even the amendment itself in 1920 was the result of nearly a century of work and generations after generations of women who had been working and passing, as Ambassador Power mentioned, that baton on to the next generation to continue the fight. And a lot of the things that we see today, whether it's mass parades and marches in the street, or picketing outside the White House and protesting, or wearing buttons and pins and carrying tote bags and merch that advertise your support for the causes, were all things that were honed by the suffragists. One of the things that they were so good at was really capitalizing on this and creating this visual culture of their movement. The suffrage movement emerged around the same time as the medium of photography. And so the suffragists were very conscious, not just about how they were fighting, but also about how that was perceived, and how they could use photography and artifacts and visual tools like that. And also things that created really striking visuals like mass protests, where they would all wear white to put a human face on their movement, and also to sway people to the cause and sort of make it so omnipresent that you could not have an opinion. And so they've sort of created this art of like public relations and almost like memification in way that we see protests spread today. They didn't have social media, but in a lot of ways they were doing the same thing that we now see women and all people using to make change in our society today. And of course, a lot of the same issues that they were fighting for, as I mentioned, are things that people are still talking about today. Things like access to the ballot, we see, and fighting voter suppression and increasing representation for women in government. The suffrage movement was never just about fighting for the vote. It was about making sure also that women had a voice in the rooms where laws were made, and ensuring that all women were equal in the eyes of the law. And those were all still things that we're still struggling with today.
It's really interesting parallels. Thank you for sharing that. Another thing that's fanning the flames, governments weighing whether to pull out of the Istanbul Convention. That's the Council of Europe Accord pledging to prevent and eliminate domestic violence and promote equality. Elif, if I may, here we are at a time when domestic violence, which you've also written about violence in some of your books, and violence towards women is off the charts. Crises like the one we're living through always make it worse. This is no surprise. How can this be so?
Yes, indeed. And actually, if I may also follow up on what Jennifer so eloquently pointed out, to me, it was, of course, very heartwarming to see US Congresswomen, dressed all in white when Donald Trump was giving his State of Union address. The reason why I mention this is because I can't also help comparing the 19th Amendment with, what the activism of today. And it's very heartwarming to see more minority women, more women entering politics, but also moving the ladder up. But the reason I mention this is because sometimes when we make a progress, there is a backlash. So it's not an easy journey. It's not a linear journey. And it is relevant in the context of Istanbul Convention, because just when you think you're making some progress, you find states, countries, regimes can take things again backwards. And I think we women need to be very much aware of this. Just to put it in a context, Istanbul Convention was ratified, it was launched in Istanbul, hence the name, and it is the best international standard to protect victims against domestic violence and gender violence, to provide a legal standard, to also open shelters and crisis centers, and also increase awareness. And make sure that the victims do not feel alone. So it does protect women, it also protects children, and it protects minorities, sexual minorities, all of which I find very important. Turkey, interestingly, was the first country to sign this important convention. And since then, 45 countries plus the EU, they have all signed it. And now the same country, Turkey, is trying to withdraw from the convention. And there's a huge campaign in Turkey full of slander and misinformation saying that the Istanbul Convention and feminists in general are trying to destroy Turkish family values. I find this very important and relevant because it's not only happening in Turkey. Poland, interestingly, where the LGBTQ minority have now become enemy number one, unfortunately, Poland is also having the same debates about Istanbul Convention. Another country in the midst of Europe where this is happening is Hungary. So again, it's not a coincidence that wherever we see a rise in authoritarianism, we see this anti-feminist backlash happening. Even in countries like Spain, where we thought we would never see this, with the Vox movement which likes to talk about the good old days of Franco, hiring buses, driving buses around the country with pictures of Hitler and writing underneath #feminazi, claiming that feminists have gone too far and they're destroying Spanish family values. We see the same thing in Italy with Salvini, right? Organizing in Verona these family conferences with money coming from evangelical organizations in America. Again, he's talking about Italian feminists destroying Italian family values. So there's a pattern here. And I find it very important that as we keep struggling for equality and justice and dignity, we also need to be prepared for this constant backlash. And I think that's very relevant, especially for the age we're living in.
I think it's fascinating. And actually, I want to mention something else that came up in our centennial project that we did. I want to take a moment, and you've kind of answered a little bit of this, Elif, but maybe I can put it to our other two panelists. I want to take a moment to discuss the antis, who are members of this highly organized women-led anti-suffrage movement. Back then, of course, it seemed so counterintuitive that a woman could possibly be opposed to her own rights, at least maybe the way looking at it through 2020 eyes, I don't know. Yet we have seen antis in various forms all throughout our history. And I keep thinking of Phyllis Schlafly, who springs to mind for me. But I'm curious to hear from you, Samantha, or you, Jennifer, or if you have more to add, who are the antis of 2020? They could be specific groups, or it could be sort of metaphors, or you can sort of choose to answer the question how you will, but what or who are the antis of 2020? Samantha, if you want to go ahead and start.
If the idea is you argue against your interests, you could look at not the non-college educated white voters who shifted from being Obama voters in 2008 and 2012 to being Trump voters in 2016, which, given that the election was settled by 78,000 votes spread across 3 states, ended up just being a hugely important pivotal swing block. And they believed, that the inequality that has widened, that has been with us forever, but that has widened in precipitous ways in recent decades, and particularly since the financial crisis, that was something that Trump would address, when Trump had sort of told us who he was in many, many ways from the outset. The other association that comes to mind is, among the enablers around President Trump, particularly in the Republican Party, there are some, Senator Marco Rubio is a good example of this, who for a very long time, have sort of hailed the American story, the inclusive story, the fact that we're a nation of immigrants, his own parents coming from Cuba and resettling here. And, as an immigrant myself, this story resonated with me, even if I didn't like much of what Marco Rubio was seeking to do on the domestic front. But now you see, in light of where the wind is blowing and where the Republican Party has gone in becoming the party of Trump, those people, following along hook, line, and sinker, including by putting in place judges that will be with us, not only in the next, if Biden wins in the Biden years, but will be with us, 20 years from now, when the kids of recent presidents are eligible to run for office. So I think there's that. I mean, I'd be careful of just, you're a woman and therefore you must have a certain set of views, right? Because first of all, one never knows the amount of coercion and whatever else, what true consent is. One never knows what kind of information anybody's receiving on a given day. If you're a Fox News viewer, and that's just what your TV is programmed on, I don't know, if I was a Fox News viewer, even if I desperately hoped that the rich would be taxed more so that I would be taxed less and have more resources for my schools and my neighborhood, if I watched Fox News, I would believe that there was going to be a big dividend for working class people. So, and I don't know I'm sure Jen will give us the comparable story among suffragettes, but they also, might be voting on or might be, their positions might be being crafted for a set of motivations that have less to do with this. There might be a fear that if you vote, suddenly somebody's going to come and take care of your child that isn't you. There might be trade-offs that we can't even conceive of, how they're thinking about it. Or They might just have a different view than we would have. But anyway, I think the excavation of it all is a reminder of actually Elif's point again of the history doesn't move in a straight line, and how staggered it is, and how careful, and this is again a lesson of 2016, how careful we have to be about making assumptions on the basis of people's gender, race, socioeconomic status, about where that's going to, sort of lead them to position themselves, because we've had some pretty rude awakenings.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent point. And Jennifer, I'd love for you to hop in here and kind of draw on some of the history that you've researched. If you want to talk about that, or if you can certainly go to 2020 as well. But I think none of us are as expert on suffrage as you are. So maybe tell us a little bit more about that and how that relates to today.
Sure. Well, I think it all goes to the point that has been raised by both of my fellow panelists already, which is that at any time you have the potential to expand rights and expand power to a group of people that has not traditionally held it, there are going to be people who resist that, and who, changes, big structural societal change is scary. And so in the case of the anti-suffragists, a lot of it stems from a fear of this disruption of traditional societal and family structures. There's this fear that if women vote, then they will no longer be interested in being mothers. It could mean the end of the human race. They will no longer have time to take care of the home. And it's the same stereotypes that you see all through the 20th century and even today, that a woman who is ambitious or has political or career aspirations must therefore hate men, must therefore not have any interest in being a partner or a parent, that you have to fit into one box, when in fact people contain multitudes, and it is not a binary. Do you have to choose? You don't have to choose. And so I think it again stems from this point that there is always these things always come in waves, and anytime there is like movement in one direction, there's always going to be people who resist that, and some movement in the other direction. And it really does drive home the point. Even if you look at the 19th Amendment specifically, it's easy 100 years later, when we see women voting and in all across the world, to think, well, of course they were going to win. Of course it was going to happen. But in fact, even up to the very day that the amendment was ratified, its fate was very uncertain. Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify and to push it over the finish line. But several other states had already had the opportunity to be the 36th and had rejected the amendment. And when it came down to the actual vote that day, it only passed by 4 votes. And so it really just reinforces how fragile these victories are, and how much work still has to be done to not take them for granted, and to continue to work to make sure that they are preserved and strengthened and expanded for more and more people.
Yeah, I want to think, you said the dreaded word, actually, you said the word ambitious. I want to, none of us, of course, on this panel are ambitious at all. That would be terrible. I want to just take a moment to think about the words that we use and the way that we describe women. I want to go back to Kamala Harris. She's obviously had a huge week, and it's inevitable. It's inevitable that she is going to face lines of questioning, and she already has faced lines of questioning and criticism from the media and the public that a male candidate wouldn't face. Ambition being one of those dreadful things that come up again and again. Samantha, you've been in the public eye. I'd love to hear from you, at the risk of making you the gender media police here. But I would also love to hear from you, Jennifer or Elif, if you have something to add. But I would really want to hear, what will you be on the lookout for as we get in deeper into this already very fraught election cycle, on how the media will be reporting on Kamala Harris, words, thoughts, ideas, problems that will just kind of come up again and again. Any thoughts?
Sure. Elif is such a prominent public figure in Turkey and beyond. I'd be very interested in her views. I would say on Senator Harris, I was very struck by the early reaction to her selection, which was, in fact, by and large, that Biden had made the safe choice. that was sort of across the airwaves. And you want to just ask yourself, particularly in light of what Elif was saying earlier about, kind of the authoritarian personality and how they go after LGBTQ and minorities and women, and it's just a pattern across time and space. But the notion that choosing Kamala Harris in 2020 in the age of Trump, that is the safe choice, to choose a woman, any woman, and to choose a woman who is the daughter of a Jamaican father and an Indian mother at a time when immigration has never been more contested or more misleading or more likely to generate the emotions, unfortunately, of the negative kind mainly, but a little bit now counter-reaction in part because of more storytelling, I think, in meeting people where they are, but a very hot and divisive issue. Bear in mind, again, that our current President Trump, has actually stripped the phrase nation of immigrants from the US Citizenship and Immigration Service sort of mantra, the defining mandate of the part of our government that still processes green cards and naturalization and so forth. So I thought that was a kind of funny, I don't know exactly even how to place it in the context of your question, but just people confusing the expected choice with the safe choice, and like people who should know better and know all the, a lot of what we're describing here in the dynamics. The other association that comes to mind, because really when you talk about this sort of piling on all these ambitious women, or Donald Trump calling her nasty, and using the kind of language that would never be used for even Democratic foes of his as he perceives them. But really what you're talking about is unconscious bias, or, depending on how far out on the spectrum you get, some pretty conscious bias. But among kind of mainstream journalists, just the recitation of, or the questioning, the way, and we saw this a lot actually in our Democratic primary here, which is a little inside baseball, but, as Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris and Amy Klobuchar and others, weren't necessarily sort of prevailing in the early primaries, or doing as well as they might have been expected to do, or as many hoped. When you look at the exit polls, you'd see a lot of primary voters saying, I'm ready to elect a woman, but I know from 2016 and from my life that nobody else is, right? So, and all that matters to me is defeating Donald Trump. So I'm going to internalize that bias, right? And so the question of electability becomes a proxy for other people's bias, which you may be gauging relatively accurately, but it may be that we're conflating, a Trump voter with an independent voter or a swing voter or whatever, and that their votes in 2016, as we've discussed, may have had more to do with the economic recession and inequality than it did sexism. It's just hard to unpack what it actually was, but you can come out of an experience like 2016 and then start to internalize those biases kind of on behalf of even gender equality, right? Last thing I'd say, just because it's just too good a story not to share in light of your question, is I was involved in my last year as US ambassador to the UN with helping select the next Secretary General, the current Secretary General, who, as you may have noticed, is a dude. Is not a woman. And there was a movement to get a female Secretary General finally elected, and the process is inside baseball, but you have to clear the Security Council and the veto holders, and you have to clear the General Assembly, and lots of countries signed on to kind of petitions for a female Secretary General. But you still had to get past the fact that Vladimir Putin, Barack Obama, President Xi, all of these leaders and the majority in the General Assembly had to agree on someone. And not everybody has the same gender politics, and some candidates, were stronger and weaker than others, regardless of their gender. But what was interesting was going around, and some of my most progressive male colleagues who on every feminist issue, on reproductive health or on preventing sexual violence or sexual trafficking, they were right by my side. But when I would say, look, maybe it's the year for a female Secretary General, I should say we did get more women into the race, than in the entire prior 70-year history of the UN. So there was, the pool got bigger, but the outcome was a guy. But nonetheless, before we got to the outcome, to say from these gentlemen that I would go and visit with. I mean, the one that comes to mind was my Portuguese colleague. And I said, I think, this is the year. Like, it's been 70 years. This is a little ridiculous, right? Let's make the UN fit for purpose. Let's bring it up to the 21st century. And he's like, okay. But just make sure that she's competent. And my Jordanian colleague, a female, Dina Kawar, who's a superstar diplomat from Jordan, she had the best reaction I ever heard of that. She's like, what do these guys think? Do they think that someone's just going to kind of slip through the cracks and become Secretary General of the United Nations? Do they think like some woman's going to say, well, I was going to do my hair, or I was going to go shopping today, but I decided I just become Secretary General instead. And it was again with a colleague and colleagues that are on the right side of all the issues, but just that sense that comes out in those moments. And that when we'll have true progress, it's when those kind of slips of the tongue, happen, not because political correctness, enforcement is up, but because it just doesn't, that's not how people think about merit.
Absolutely. And the assumption being that all men are competent. So that's
right. Last I checked. Yeah, exactly.
But you did end up bringing in a self-proclaimed arch feminist to the role. So
who had the best track record on women's empowerment, even compared to the women, but nonetheless.
He has a good track record still so far today. I do want to bring this question back to you, Elif. If you would like to think a little bit about how we talk about our female politicians, the competence thing, is she capable of doing the job, likability, ambition? Yeah. You're all words, people, but I wonder if you might kind of think about that and some of those sort of traps and watch out areas.
Indeed, and actually we have experienced this in the UK firsthand in a way, because throughout this endless Brexit saga, we've had Theresa May and then Boris Johnson dealing with Brexit. And to me, it was very interesting because the UK became my adopted country. I've settled down here. And when I first moved to this country, I used to think British people are so calm when they talk about politics. After 12 years, with all the changes, I no longer think that way. But particularly interesting was to see how the media treated Theresa May and then how they treated Boris Johnson. Now, clearly, I do not agree with Brexit. I do not agree with their views. But that's not my point here. She was judged much, much more harshly. And I think in some ways, maybe sometimes female politicians, understandably, or many women, maybe we do this, in order to exist in this male-dominated world, sometimes we end up thinking we have to suppress our emotions or not to show our emotions a lot. Whereas Boris Johnson had never had to go through that. He could make all kinds of blunders and gaffes, and it was okay. It was actually, it was regarded as honest blunders. So it was completely different the way media treated the two of them. And what worries me is, particularly coming back to your question about Senator Harris, Kamala Harris, she will be, of course, slandered a lot. There will be a lot of misinformation. And what is especially worrying is these epistemological tribes that we have been divided into. If people get all their information from the same sources, and if it all becomes about identity, then it's almost like a knee-jerk reaction. This fear of losing your identity if the other side comes to power. That fear blocks everything. It even is a big obstacle in front of rational thinking. And that is something that worries me. In other words, I don't think it's a coincidence that all around the world, all populist demagogues, when you study the way they behave, they want to divide between us and them, and they thrive upon tension, polarization. So one of our biggest challenges is going to be, how do we find ways to communicate while we're very critical of all kinds of discrimination, of all demagogues and of all their narratives? How do we connect with people who might be born into very different family structures, who might be coming from different backgrounds? This is a question that I ask myself a lot as a writer. And I think it's important. Maybe we're all divided into epistemological tribes, but I think it's much more dominant across the right wing. There was a study, peer research study, that was quite interesting, which showed in America, when people are asked how many media outlets they trust, the conservative base named only 8 sources. The Democrats named around 22 sources, so it was more widespread. But if you only read the same sources day in and day out and get your information from those sources, you might easily end up hating people. That is the one thing that we have to challenge. And for that, I think we need to connect with people who think differently than us.
Right. And one of the things I always think about is the points of commonality that we actually have. There are many things we probably want: safety, security for the children, you know, food on the table, able to pay rent. I mean, these are common human needs. So,
but for that to happen, maybe we need to think of ourselves in terms of multiple belongings rather than a singular identity. Because if I'm given a single identity, if you're given a single identity, then clash is inevitable. And that's the one thing we need to challenge, I believe, you know, that kind of exclusion of identity.
Absolutely. That was beautifully phrased, as always. Thank you. Okay, I am going to turn it to questions because I've been ignoring them while I've been listening to you. So I have a really cool, kind of interesting question here. And it gets sort of at the heart of storytelling, which is something I wanted to talk to you about anyway. So this is from DB. Val McDermott suggested that many of the women leaders, plus Nicola Sturgeon, who is a terrific reader, have something in common. They all read fiction. And fiction is important because it builds empathy with characters and understanding complex situations, as opposed to, say, reading biographies of Churchill. I do not know if all female global readers read fiction, but maybe you do. But if you don't know for sure as a fact, should we just kind of reframe the question a little bit and just say, should all leaders be reading more fiction? What can fiction add in terms of perspective and empathy and all of these things that are clearly so much needed? And Elif, perhaps you'd like to begin with that.
Yeah. You know, sometimes I hear people saying, I don't read fiction, I read important stuff. I read politics, history, economy. I don't have time for fiction. And to me, that always makes me sad, because I think everything that's the subject of life is the subject of fiction. Inside fiction, you have psychology, you have politics, you have philosophy, you have everything there. But more than that, I think you have emotional intelligence. And I don't know a single person in this world who doesn't need emotional intelligence. Whether we're bakers, designers, engineers, politicians, students, teachers, we all need empathy. We all need emotional intelligence. And I agree, it makes a huge difference if our politicians, I wish Bolsonaro, I mean, I can't imagine Erdogan reading fiction. I can't imagine them reading books. It would have made a big difference. To me, it's much healthier and better for our soul and for our intellect if we read across the board, fiction and non-fiction together, and also read books that are out of our comfort zones, because those are the books that are going to challenge us intellectually.
Could I add here? It's hard to add to anything she says, but you know, if you think about fiction in its essence, and I'm no expert, having never written it, but having consumed it, it's about walking in the shoes of others. You know, a great writer just brings you in not only to one character and to the narrator, but to a boundless number of characters. And if you think about a surefire recipe to have the capacity to see somebody else's multiple identities, or as she put it, multiple belongings, that's just a great vehicle for being able to do that oneself, or refining that capacity in oneself. You know, to think there but for the grace, to take that next step of there but for the grace of God go I. And I would only add, just anecdotally, I know we're short on time, but just when I was UN ambassador, I didn't create a book club. That would have been the best thing to be able to describe doing here. But I did choose to take advantage of being in the home of Broadway. And one of the things I write about in The Education of an Idealist was this amazing experience of bringing different ambassadors to theater productions. And instead of being oppositional with them and squaring off against them on LGBTQ rights or on Ukraine or on Syria, we were facing the characters together. We were ourselves being led into the shoes, including one of the plays we saw was Fun Home, the LGBTQ themed musical, and going with African ambassadors and the Russian ambassador to that. They start, very coy, what am I doing here? I'm going to get in trouble in my capital. But the richness of this character, this female character who's describing not wanting to have a crush on a girl and being overtaken by that, it became not about being a gay woman, but about having a crush that you don't want to have. And then her family story, and you could just see them kind of melt into the characters. And we did it with Hamilton and Eclipsed on sexual violence in Liberia, and you could see the effects. I can't draw a thick magic marker line between that and some big policy achievements, but it's about, again, expanding the worldview and having one's tentacles up for other people's experiences.
That's just fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. We've got another question here from Charlotte H. This is a heavy question. It sounds straightforward, but to me it's not. Do you think that women have to act more masculine at the moment in order to be taken seriously by men in leadership roles in male-dominated environments? I'm going to throw a bit of a curveball and I'm going to ask Jennifer just to touch on this I know. I'm going to ask you to touch on it with the historical perspective. I would just be really curious to hear whether there was a tendency among women to act a certain way, and maybe it wasn't masculine at all, and perhaps not. And then I'd love to hear from you in particular, Samantha, who has been the sole woman in so many rooms full of men. But we have to be quick. So Jennifer, if you have any thoughts from your sort of historical deep dive.
Well, I think there's sort of two angles historically on this. One is that a lot of the criticism that the anti-suffragist factions and press levied at the women who were fighting for the vote was that they were masculine, or that fighting for the vote, and particularly the work that they were doing, organizing and on the streets, was not feminine work. But the suffrage movement really at its core was about not just voting or political power, but this reimagining of the role of women in the world. And part of that was about breaking down these constraints of what is masculine versus feminine. There were many early suffragists who were advocates of dress reform, basically said, we are physically constricted in our everyday lives by the very clothing that we wear. And so we shouldn't have to wear corsets. We should be able to wear pants if we want to, or bloomers, little like pantaloons, underskirts, and not be considered masculine. And you can still be just as feminine and just as much a woman while also having freedom of movement and power and having a voice. And again, these are, like, I keep hammering on this point, but there's so many, it is still something we are still struggling with and dealing with today. And I think this idea that there is a dichotomy, and that one is you're either masculine or feminine, or that to be masculine is to be powerful or competent, and that to be feminine is to be more passive or submissive is a false one, and one that we should combat.
All right, we're gonna say a quick goodbye to Ambassador Power. She needs to depart right now, I think. I would, if you are willing, I would love to ask one really, really quick lightning round question. Okay, you're all storytellers and you can't pretend otherwise. And I'd like you to spend one moment thinking about a world that doesn't yet exist but might be. What thing do you see in the future? What do you hope for? What would you like to change coming out of COVID? It's just the two of you now. So Elif, if you want to take a crack at it, and then we'll end with Jennifer, and then we will cut it off because we are already over time.
Well, I think the world that I have in mind is one that takes inequality seriously, not as a footnote, not as a side issue, But I do believe sincerely that we need to talk about inequalities of all kinds, injustices of all kinds across the board. Take it seriously. What worries me is we have clearly massive challenges ahead, and these are global challenges, whether we're talking about climate emergency, the possibility of another pandemic, whether it's cyber terrorism, financial deregulation, economic crisis. All of these are global challenges in which we're all interconnected. So the problem is we're trying to solve these global challenges with the forces of nationalism, with the forces of tribalism or isolationism. So the world that I would like to imagine is one that understands how we're all interconnected, maybe values humanism, values equality, takes inequality seriously, and definitely gives more voice to women, young people especially, and to minorities. I think in order to build that world, we need to pay more attention, not to the center, but to the periphery, to the margins, to people who have been silenced, disempowered, disadvantaged, and try to change it, try to give more voice to people who have less voice, to try to make the invisible more visible and bring the periphery to the center. And that means we need to see this as a crossroads, as a new beginning. Something is clearly ending, but we are yet to build that new world. And so we're in between, and that in between is a tiring, is also period, because it's full of uncertainties, but also it could be the beginning of something hopefully better.
Lovely. Jennifer, any parting thoughts on what you would like to see in the future?
Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind is we've seen a lot of headlines, justifiably, I think, celebrating the fact that Kamala Harris she is the first woman will be the first woman on a major party's presidential ticket. She's the first African-American, the first person of Indian descent. African-American woman, not African-American person. And while that's exciting, it's also kind of sad that it is 2020 and we are just now celebrating all of these firsts. And so I think in my ideal vision of the future, there is a world where we have far fewer firsts, and instead it is no longer considered groundbreaking or unexpected that a woman, a person of color, someone from the LGBTQ community would be in a position of power, in a position of leadership, that is considered part of the course and normal, and no longer a milestone, but just another step along a very long path. Right. And also a world where everybody reads fiction.
Read your books, and we've certainly been seeing the changes in the US Congress. Well, thank you so much for your extraordinary thoughts, your ideas. It was wonderful to have you. Thank you to our audience who are there somewhere. We've loved chatting, and I think that's it.
Thank you.